Canadians can expect food to take up a larger share of their household budgets in the next year, as a new report shows the average family could be spending nearly $1,000 more on the basics in 2026. For Hamilton families, that increase means making tough choices.
Trump's tariff war destroying Canada's food supply chain. March 2025. Bloomberg reported Trump's trade war is causing chaos for farmers and food producers on both sides of the US-Canada border. April 2025. Food prices in Canada jumped 3.8% year over year as tariffs started hitting grocery shelves. June 2025. Infant formula up 6%, coffee up 10%, beef cuts up 13%. 1 in 4 Canadians experiencing food insecurity, 10 million people, a level never seen before. This isn't a trade dispute, this is Canada's food supply collapsing in real time. December 2025. I'm going to break down exactly what's happening at the border, which foods are disappearing from shelves, why provinces are issuing emergency warnings, and what this means for your grocery bill in 2026. Because while economists talk about supply chain disruptions, families are choosing between paying rent and buying food. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to understand how tariff chaos is emptying Canadian grocery stores. February 2025. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. March 2025. Partial exemptions for CUSMA-compliant goods, but only 38% of Canadian imports qualify. Canada retaliated with 25% counter tariffs on $155 billion worth of US goods. Think about what that means. Every time food crosses the Canada-US border, and it crosses constantly, multiple times during processing, it now faces 25% tariffs. A hamburger uses Canadian beef raised in the US, processed in Ontario, served on Canadian wheat buns. That hamburger just got 25% more expensive, multiple times. July 2025. Canadian food manufacturers reported rising costs, supply chain instability, and cross-border uncertainty. One food service distributor, tariffs are adding cost pressure and volatility just as we're regaining stability. Many companies are now embedding tariff clauses and shifting suppliers entirely. Here's what that looks like on your grocery store shelf. Consumer Price Index shows food purchased from stores increased 3.9% between January and April 2025, fueled by tariffs. But those are averages. Specific items got destroyed. Infant formula, up 6%. Coffee, up about 10%. Some beef cuts, up about 13%. You're paying 13% more for beef because Trump wanted to punish Canada over border security. Your baby formula costs 6% more because of trade war retaliation. Your morning coffee jumped 10% because supply chains that worked for decades suddenly stopped working. March 2025. Tariffs can disrupt established supply chains. Businesses are forced to find new suppliers or pay higher prices. These changes cause delays and increase operational costs, which affect product availability for customers, food industry analysts reported. Let me translate that corporate speak for you. Food shortages, products disappearing from shelves, empty sections in grocery stores, temporarily out of stock signs becoming permanent. Here's why. Canada and the US have the most integrated food supply chain on Earth. Mexican produce that normally enters the US is now being diverted to Canada because of tariffs, creating oversupply that crashes prices for Canadian farmers while simultaneously creating shortages of other products. Pork production is one example of a deeply integrated network now torn apart. Canadian pigs raised for 6 months, shipped to US for processing, shipped back to Canada as pork chops. Each border crossing now faces 25% tariffs. That same pork chop that cost $8 last year, now $12, if it's available at all. American dairy processors that rely on Canadian milk products are now paying more, leading to higher retail prices for cheese and butter. Meat producers who depend on Canadian livestock imports face mounting expenses, contributing to higher prices at butcher counters. Fresh produce faces additional costs that make fruits and vegetables less affordable or unavailable. Now let's talk about what this means for you personally. March 2024, more than 2 million visits recorded at Canadian food banks, a 90% increase in just 5 years. That was before tariffs hit grocery prices. 1 in 4 Canadians now experiencing food insecurity. That's 10 million people. Think about that. 1 in 4. If you're watching this with 3 friends, statistically, one of you can't afford adequate food. And food banks are a last resort. People visit food banks when everything else has failed, when they've chosen between rent and groceries and chosen rent. Windsor, Ontario, unemployment hit 10.8% in May 2025, up from 7.8% in May 2024, driven by tariff impacts on automotive, food processing, and agricultural shipping. Entire cities collapsing because their economies depend on cross-border food trade that no longer works. Here's the agricultural devastation. March 2025, China imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil, canola meal, and peas, plus 25% tariffs on pork, fish, and seafood. Canola is Canada's second-largest crop, 21 million acres, $13.6 billion in farm cash receipts in 2023. Canadian exports of canola meal to China, $920.9 million in 2024, wiped out. Farmers who planted canola expecting Chinese buyers suddenly have zero market. Early 2025, U.S. Department of Agriculture data shows an 8.5% drop in beef and pork exports compared to 2024. Fed cattle prices plummeted 22.6%, with estimated revenue losses of $4.02 billion. Cattle prices down 22.6%, farmers losing $4 billion. But beef prices for consumers, UP 13%. How does that work? Supply chain chaos, border delays, tariff costs, processing disruptions. Farmers get destroyed while consumers pay more and grocery store shelves sit empty. Canadian food businesses facing compounding trade challenges and adopting new tactics, including renegotiating supplier contracts, diversifying supply sources, and adjusting pricing models. Translation: scrambling to find any way to keep food flowing while passing every cost increase to you. Tariff disruption is no longer a short-term issue, it's a structural shift, industry analysts concluded. Canadian food businesses must proactively transform their supply chains, pricing strategies, and market exposure if they hope to thrive. Structural shift. That's economist code for this isn't temporary. The food supply chain that fed Canadians for 75 years just broke, and it's not coming back. Here's why provinces are issuing warnings. Research suggests 25% tariffs could reduce Canada's GDP by 2-3%. Approximately 2.4 million Canadian jobs tied to U.S. exports, from automotive manufacturing in Ontario to potato farming in Prince Edward Island. These jobs, whether directly involved in exporting or part of the supplier network, face disruption, reduced hours, and heightened uncertainty. Alberta. Over 1/4 of income comes from exports to the U.S., making it particularly exposed. When those exports collapse, Alberta's economy collapses. Jobs disappear, tax revenue evaporates, social services get cut, and food banks overflow. CEO of Food, Health and Consumer Products of Canada, Canada's deep reliance on the U.S. market leaves us particularly vulnerable to such tariffs. Agricultural exports, including $8.6 billion in canola, exemplify the risks. Tariffs slash profitability for Canadian producers and impede access to a market integral to our economy. $8.6 billion in canola exports. Think about that number. That's not just farmers losing money. That's entire rural communities built around canola production. Equipment dealers, seed suppliers, transportation companies, grain elevators, small-town restaurants and shops that depend on farm income, all collapsing simultaneously. Businesses, from small farmers to large retailers, already face growing uncertainty, making long-term planning increasingly difficult, the CEO warned. Disrupted supply chains, escalating costs, and a ripple effect that could destabilize agriculture and manufacturing sectors. You can't run a farm when you don't know if your crops will have buyers. You can't operate a food processing plant when tariffs change weekly. You can't manage a grocery chain when suppliers can't promise deliveries. Here's the direct impact on your family's food security. Tariffs on aluminum, steel, lumber create higher costs for transportation, packaging, and other supply chain components that are largely invisible but responsible for moving food to stores. Increased costs plus short preparation time could mean consumers see shortages alongside higher prices on groceries, especially for fresh, perishable foods like berries, bananas, tomatoes, avocados, peppers, and seafood. Berries, bananas, tomatoes, avocados, peppers, seafood. All imported, all with short shelf lives. Delays in customs, importers holding out for better prices, smaller available selection due to retaliatory tariffs. Any delay causes spoilage before products arrive in stores. Your favorite produce section? Half empty because fresh food rotted at the border waiting for tariff paperwork, or never got shipped because importers couldn't afford the 25% surcharge, or came from Mexico instead of the US, but tastes different and costs more because supply chains got rerouted overnight. Canada's food price report forecasted food prices rising 3 to 5% for 2025. That was before the full tariff impact hit. Tariffs or restrictions on Canadian imports could strain cross-border trade and increase prices for Canadian consumers while undermining the economic stability of our agricultural sector, the report warned. Now here's what scares provincial governments. If tariffs persist, Canada is at risk not just of short-term disruption, but long-term structural damage to its agri-food sector. Rising input costs, shrinking revenues, and market volatility are squeezing farmers and weakening overall competitiveness. Structural damage. Farmers going bankrupt. Food processors shutting down. Some Canadian producers already struggling with oversupply due to market disruption. Too much of products nobody can afford. Not enough of products everyone needs. Indigenous farmers who rely on cross-border trade face threats to economic sovereignty and food access. Remote communities depending on imported goods for food supply face crisis. Communities already facing food insecurity now facing complete supply chain collapse. Here's the bottom line for Canadian families. Food prices jumped 3.8% in April 2025, infant formula up 6%, coffee up 10%, beef up 13%, 1 in 4 Canadians food insecure, 10 million people, 2 million monthly food bank visits. And this is December 2025. The chaos is just beginning. Canada's food supply chain operated on 75 years of predictable cross-border trade. Farmers planted knowing their markets. Processors invested knowing their suppliers. Grocers stocked knowing deliveries would arrive. That certainty is gone, replaced by tariff chaos, border delays, retaliatory measures, and supply disruptions. Your grocery bill in 2026? Higher. Product selection? Smaller. Food security? Threatened. And provinces are warning this could get much, much worse before it stabilizes. This story will define how Canadian families eat for the next decade. Stay tuned.